So thank you. I'm finding this a little bit weird. It's like a sort of a bad martial arts movie that's been dubbed into English. So anyway, so good morning, and thank you very much, Charlie. Actually, I was terrified that I was going to contradict everything that you said, but actually we're kind of going backwards to a certain extent from the translation right back to the researcher when Maria comes around. So I'm in the middle, essentially, as a funding agency, and what I'd like to talk to you today is about the integrity challenges that we face in evaluating innovation and the pathway to impact. We work in a resource-limited environment as a funding agency, and we've increasingly seen a distrustful public. So we're very conscious about that. But we're also working within a kind of quite a vulnerable political system where, you know, governments last 4 years, 5 years, if we're lucky, or even less sometimes. So the thing is that there's increasing pressure now to demonstrate that research produces societal and economic benefits and not just new knowledge. From a funding agency's perspective, what we're looking to do really is try to gather information and evidence to help us make resource allocation decisions in this resource-limited environment. Governments, politicians, policymakers, they're looking for evidence to support their policy and political agendas, and that might be job creation, it might be trying to prop up an ailing health service, and so on and so forth. And the public themselves... The public are looking for evidence that their hard-earned tax dollars are actually being well spent. But, you know, everybody's actually looking for the same thing at the end of the day, even though we might be coming at it from slightly different perspectives. And that is, we want to see the most benefit from public investment with the least amount of waste. But we're also conscious that we're trying to support policy and political agendas, and obviously we want to minimise downstream damage from the research that we do. The other thing about evaluation is that it actually provides a really important interface for funding agencies and their stakeholders, and it's maybe something people don't think about because it actually sometimes is the only interface we have with the people we fund, in that they come and, you know, we evaluate their proposal, we monitor them as they go along, we look at the outputs at the end of the day, and that's it. That's all the interface we have with those researchers. For government departments, policymakers, the public, often the interface or the communication we have with them is through our evaluation processes. So actually the activity is very important. It's also a means for us to drive behaviour. We can do that through the eligibility criteria that we use in our funding schemes, you know, and we can also introduce things that we hope will drive better behaviours than some of the ones we've seen so far. For example, we've introduced mandatory open access in all of the publications that we fund. We have introduced mandatory research integrity training. I know you don't possibly agree with it for everyone, but we've said no, it's got to be everyone. It's got to be the PIs, it's got to be the postdocs, it's got to be the PhD students. Everybody has to take on some kind of training, and it's really about awareness raising in this instance. We have mandatory trial regulation. We're a health funding agency, so we fund quite a lot of clinical trials, and we've got requirements that people have stakeholder involvement or engagement when they come to us. But it is also a means of driving innovation and implementation to the kind of questions that we ask around translation when we're actually looking at what's come out of people's funding. So what do we measure at the moment? Well, based on the Buxton and Hiney model of kind of inputs, outputs, outcomes and impacts, on the input side, when somebody's developing a proposal, we want to hear about the novelty of their idea, but we also want to hear about the relevance of their idea. That's really important. And we want to know whether or not there's an evidence gap that people are actually addressing. So is there a need for this research? We want to know how they're going to manage the programme, especially if it's a big bit of funding. And we also want to hear from them what they think the potential impacts of their research might be. At the outputs end of things, which is the direct product, so the kind of stuff you'd expect to see within, 2 to 3 years, hopefully, we have quite a lot of dissemination metrics around publication and so on and so forth. We've knowledge transfer metrics. We've got practice-based metrics because, again, we work in a health environment, and we do look at things like IP, data outputs, collaborations, because it is about collaboration at the end of the day, and capacity building. When it comes to the outcomes, I mean, really, We're not expecting as many in a small project. Obviously, for some of the bigger ones, we really are looking for some outcomes. So we want to see the use of those outputs that people have developed through the research out there in the community. We want to see that somebody's using their publications, for example, that policymakers are actually taking up the evidence that they're using, that they've developed new products or IP that has led to licenses, that they've managed to leverage some funding, for example. And the impacts part, that kind of downstream effects on society and the economy. We don't really, as a funding agency, measure that very much because that's very hard to measure when you're talking about things like whether or not better services emerge or whether or not there's better quality of life for people who have been the subjects of research. And as Charlie mentioned, there is a big timing issue here. For funding agencies in terms of what they can actually realistically measure in the research process. Because unfortunately, the amount of time that it takes for outputs to be translated into ultimate impacts, it can often be very poorly understood at a political level. There is a big problem there because there's an expectation of short-term and immediate gains. And our fear is that this puts pressure on both us and the researchers to kind of naivetize the research process and make claims about potential or actual impacts that can be quite aspirational, which isn't a good thing. But at the end of the day, without good practices as we go through those inputs, outputs, outcomes and so on, how can we trust the evidence that's actually being produced, the things that we measure? And to make it a little bit more complicated, when we move into innovation and impact, we start thinking about those. We also need to start thinking about how we can incorporate responsible research and innovation as well as research integrity issues into the evaluation frameworks that we use. Because the thing is that even though they're often spoken about in the same breath, they're not actually the same thing. Research integrity is very much about a codification of behaviours expected of individuals and of their institutions and their professionals associations, whereas responsible research and innovation really deals with the kind of dimensions of what happens in to the outcomes and the outputs and what the end user's perspective is on that around, aligning those processes responsibly that we get desired and acceptable outcomes. And that's a big thing with responsible research and innovation. People are looking for acceptable and trustworthy outcomes. The principles that underlie research integrity are kind of very well understood at this stage, starting off with the Singapore Statement. It's around honesty and accountability and reliability and trustworthiness and duty of care and so on, whereas the principles that are starting to be described around responsible research and innovation are very much about inclusivity and reflecting and anticipating and being responsive and when you see sort of things going off the rails a little bit. And it's about really taking on a duty of care for the use of innovations. So essentially research integrity kind of defines a collective responsibility of the individual and their institution and also the funding agencies, whereas responsible research and innovation is really talking about cooperative responsibility, kind of a meta-responsibility through wide interdisciplinarity. So I'm talking about across many, many disciplines, but also deep interdisciplinarity, where you're involving people outside of the normal research processes. So essentially, to a certain extent, research integrity is focused on the present, whereas responsible research and innovation is much more forward-looking. As I say, responsible research integrity are kind of, it's inward-facing, it's addressing quality, reliability, trustworthiness of the research outputs and outcomes, whereas responsible research and innovation principles are more outward-facing and addressing societal acceptability and trust. So we obviously need both when we're talking about frameworks, but I suppose I've been trying to think about this over the last while. How can we actually, as a funding agency, embed both research integrity and responsible research and innovation into evaluating when it comes to innovation and impact? Well, obviously, again, we've got our Buxton and Hiney inputs, outputs, outcomes and impacts measures that we're going to have to think about. And as Charlie pointed out, this is not a linear process. So while I'm putting it in a linear sort of model, it isn't linear. And what I'd like to think about is why we're doing this, why are we actually evaluating these things, why are we actually measuring. And I think that at the input stage, what we're really trying to do is kind of set up the conditions for positive innovation and impact. When it comes to the outputs and outcomes, we're really trying to move things towards innovation, translation and uptake ultimately. And then at the impact side of things, we're trying to advance those benefits and influences out in the bigger world. But the problem for a funding agency, of course, is that the level of influence we have and the level of ability we have to measure these things lessens as you go down or go across that value chain, because a lot of the stuff that happens at the impact side is well outside the funding arena for us. So let's talk about the setting up the conditions for innovation and impact, which is where we do have quite a lot of control. We're already asking a lot of questions that, when we talk about fundability and quality of a proposal, that are very much driven by research integrity concerns. We want to know about the methodology, the statistical approach, how you're going to manage your data, what's the value added of the people you're going to have around you, your collaborators and co-applicants, how are you going to manage the research, what's your governance plan, and also, are you able to do this research? What is your track record? So, what's happened to date? Unfortunately, there has been a tendency to use things like counting number of publications to determine somebody's track record, but hopefully we're going to move away from that as time goes on. We do also ask some questions around responsible research and innovation concerns. So we want to know what your dissemination plan is. So how are you going to push your results out into the world? We want to know how relevant your research is to the people who it's aimed at, and that's very much a responsible research and innovation concern. And we also do want to hear about some of the potential impacts. But unfortunately, we are a lot of the time hearing about those from the researcher's perspective as opposed to the end user's perspective. So there actually are quite a few interesting initiatives happening in this area to try and improve things a little bit and perhaps align research integrity and responsible research and innovation a little bit more closely. So the first that I have to mention is the San Francisco Declaration and the DORA Principles. This has been a really important initiative that has happened over the last number of years. And what they're trying to do, this was really sparked out of those Nature papers that Charlie mentioned, where people were talking about, there's a lot of waste, there's a lot of irreproducibility, a lot of unreliability in research. And they were saying, well, okay, how can we increase the value of research? And they gave lots of examples of things that you could do. So you actually have to establish the need for the research in the first place. We ask for systematic reviews now in a lot of our funding schemes. It's very much about trying to change the perception that publication in high-impact journals is the only game in town, and try to look much more broadly at the kind of outputs that people have that say that they're a good quality researcher. There is very much a focus on the quality of the research plan itself, but then also on the relevance of the research and the value of the research to the end user, which is very much in lines with responsible research and innovation. Another one, something my own agency has done, is we've introduced the idea of public reviewers. So we literally put ads into the papers. We invited anybody and everybody. Anybody could apply, as long as they weren't working for our organisation or they weren't being funded by us, because we had to manage conflict of interest, obviously. And we said, you can come and be a public reviewer for us. We got well over 1,000 applications to become public reviewers, a huge amount of interest. And so far we've trained up about 150 randomly selected public reviewers. And they sit down and they actually look at the applications as they come in, which is a really interesting process for them, but also for us. And we're really hoping to move this on towards being a scoring criteria in some of our future schemes. I suppose the jury's out a little bit as yet as to whether this is really going to work, but it's a very interesting kind of process for us and also for the researchers. There's another very interesting, I'm sure some of you have heard of this, James Lind Alliance in the UK, which is a priority setting partnership. And essentially what that's trying to do is use the public and use the end users of the research to identify what the priorities are in research. Where are the unmet needs in terms of evidence. And then those priorities are presented to funding agencies and say, well, listen, okay, the researchers tell you that this is what they want to do, the politicians tell you this is what they want to do, but actually the end users of the research, this is the evidence that they really want. And this is especially important for patients, for example. And so that speaks very, very strongly to responsible research and innovation concerns. I mean, obviously, it's tricky for funding agencies because we're also listening to our paymasters saying, well, we need you to do research in this area. So there is a little bit of a balance to be had there. But again, a very interesting way of trying to move stuff along. All right, that was talking about setting up the conditions. What about then moving those innovations towards translation and uptake? What kind of role can we have there? Well, again, we already collect quite a lot of knowledge translation, knowledge exchange, knowledge dissemination type metrics when we look at projects. We look at obviously things like academic dissemination, but we also want to know about knowledge brokering, about making links with policymakers, being on advisory boards, writing policy briefs, all that kind of good stuff, sharing data sets and methods and so on and so forth. But we also collect quite a lot of what I would call trust metrics. So this is where somebody is being trusted by other people because of the quality and the relevance of their research. And that could be that they're being invited to be a keynote speaker, that they're invited to chair a session, that they are being invited to sit on an advisory panel, be that for industry or a policymaker or a patient group or whatever, and that they're being asked into formation of collaborations. And I think those things really speak to what other people think about somebody, whether or not they actually trust them. Open science, of course, we can't talk about translation without talking about open science. And again, there are some, really interesting initiatives happening in this area. The big one in Europe is Plan S. So essentially what Plan S is it's a coalition of funding agencies across Europe, including the European Commission, who are saying, we want to translation to a totally open access environment. And we're going to do it quickly. We're going to do it within a couple of years. And how we're going to do it is we're going to say that all publications from public funding agencies have to be published in a compliant open access journal or on an open research platform. A lot of agencies already have this as a mandatory thing, so that's not such a big jump. Where there is a big jump, though, is what it also says is that funding agencies will only consider publications when you apply for funding that have been published in an open access compliant journal. And that's a big change for people. That one's going to take a little bit of time to wash out in the system, and it's going to be very interesting to see how that works. And also that there will be a cap on the cost of making something open access. So this could actually be quite a step change, I think, for both funders and publishers and the researchers themselves over the next couple of years. Another kind of interesting one is the Open Science Partnership Toolkit, developed by a project through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And essentially what that's trying to do is measure, were these open science collaborations actually successful? So again, we'll have to see how that gets along. Then there is this, and again, this speaks more to the responsible research and innovation side of the house, I guess, about moving from public engagement to public involvement. On the public engagement side, there's some really interesting work being done, and if anyone wants to get some ideas on how you do a bit of public engagement, have a look at matterforall.org. They've got some terrific toolkits there, and the European Commission very recently published a really interesting report on RRI, why it's important, and how you might actually go about this. But we also, public engagement is a little bit paternalistic if you think about it, because this is about, telling people why you're doing the research and why it's good for them to a certain extent. What about actually involving them in the research? And this strikes fear into the heart of a lot of researchers. I know that. So you're moving away from the kind of with, for to about, and really sort of bringing people into the research process. And we've understood that a lot of people actually don't know how to do this. They have no idea how to involve the public or patients in the research process. So we're putting some money into actually trying to train people up. We've placed PPI coordinators in a number of our universities in Ireland to actually try and build capacity in this area. And and we're going to start asking for PPI in part of a lot of our proposals. So we're going to push people towards this as time goes on. A lot of evidence would say that the outcomes of research that has involved PPI are actually much better than those that haven't, and you're much more likely to have uptake in the system. Okay, finally, looking at the advancing benefits and influences in the big word. And again, we've got a lot less control here because this is often outside of the funding process. But there are nonetheless implementation metrics that we collect. So we collect evidence about the influences of the research on policy or regulation, and whether there have actually been changes to practice because of the kind of research that we fund. Has there been any testing or uptake of products? Let's say, has there been any cost savings in a health system? These aren't really impacts as such, but they're certainly well on the way to being impacts. And all of these are dependent on reliable and robust evidence. So you're going right back to research integrity when you talk about these. But there's a lot of challenges here, and I think Charlie really nicely summed up a lot of them from a kind of an innovator's perspective, because transferring an innovation into a real-world setting and maintaining it there is a very long, very complicated, sometimes messy, often haphazard process that a lot of people don't really understand, including the funding agencies, by the way. And the thing is that implementation measures, the kind of stuff that we collect around evidence, really should not be confused with long-term and sustainable impacts. We cannot claim that those are impacts. They're just simply an indication that there might be an impact at some stage in the future. It's also very hard for us to link a specific piece of research, on the one hand, to an impact way out there in the world, on the other hand. So there's a real attribution problem for us in trying to measure this kind of stuff. Because it moves out of the realm of the original research and the original funding. And there is a need to preserve markers of trust in all of this. And we really need to think about how we might be able to do that. So, a few questions that I think I would like to explore in the focus track sessions. How much responsibility do researchers have to ensure that their innovations are actually translated? And I think, Charlie, you posed the same question again. It's a really important question. And how can we incentivise and alert the research community to the importance of both involvement and engagement of society in the research process? How can we move away from this kind of very linear, very reductionist way of thinking about assessment, high impact journals, H factors, number of publications, to better methods of assessing research? And Science Europe and the European Universities Association are actually coming together at the moment to form a group to really start trying to tease that one out, which would be interesting. Given that this is a resource-limited environment and that some of these impact assessments are very, very expensive to do, and we don't have the expertise to do them, so we usually have to commission them. How can we, as funding agency, actually do meaningful impact assessment? What can we realistically evaluate? For me, this is a big issue. How can we align what we're trying to do as funding agencies, and we're trying to do lots of different things in this area, with what's happening in the universities? At the moment, the two are not in alignment. So how can we bring those more closely together? And again, I think that's something that's really worth exploring. How can we embed markers of trust? How can we make sure that trustworthiness becomes the actual cornerstone of all of this stuff? And finally, I think if we're thinking about trustworthiness, can we take the Singapore Statement principles and simply apply them out there in the world, or do we have to think about slightly different principles as kind of articulated in the responsible research and innovation space? And can we bring those two sets of principles together for something that's really meaningful for everyone? So thank you very much for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hiney. You can hear from the applause. You were very eloquent in being able to clarify some of these questions from a funder's perspective. And in our preparation, as you know, for this talk and session, we have gone down many rabbit holes. Oh, yeah. So I will ask if there are questions from the audience, and if not, I have one.
And if there aren't now, I really do hope that you'll come to the focus track sessions to explore this further. Lex.
Maura, thank you very much. I tried to give the example by posing a question. Would you dwell a little bit further on the potential consequences of all this evaluation for, on the one side, the applicants for next research proposals, and on the other side, the future funding programs? Would it be in the realm of outputs, outcomes, most likely not impacts, but still, it might be possible. What is the use of all this? It sounds so reasonable, but how can we use it by learning and drawing consequences on the individual level or on the level of future funding programs?
Yeah. I mean, to be perfectly honest, sorry. So the question was about all of this evaluation that we're doing. What are the potential consequences or implications of this from the perspective of both the researcher themselves, but also future funding programs and their design? And there are implications. To a certain extent, funding agencies are constantly experimenting and piloting new ways of doing things and new questions that we ask, especially in the setting up the conditions, the application process. And I know that a lot of researchers feel that some of the things, that the loops that they're asked to jump through are very onerous. But at the end of the day, we've got a limited pot of money. We're trying to achieve certain things. You know, we're a health funding agency, so we're trying to achieve certain impacts, I guess, way down the line, and certainly some outputs and outcomes in the shorter term that drive better health, that drive a more efficient health system, that drive better population health or public health, and so on and so forth. So we're always trying to think about ways that we can set up those conditions. Some of them will work, some of them may not work. And we do monitor as we're going along whether or not it's really worth asking. You know, if you ask somebody for a data management plan and they're just giving you rubbish, we're just getting rubbish back, well, then we stop asking. Or we ask it in a slightly different way. Or we acknowledge, for example, and data management plan's a pretty good example here, that the problem for a lot of people is that there's no data management infrastructure in their institutions. So it's very hard for them to write a good data management plan. They can promise you the earth, but actually, realistically, they don't have an electronic system in their institution to actually manage their data. So, you know, it's not fair then to expect them to have this very sophisticated data management plan. It's not always relevant to ask somebody to have PPI in their proposal or to have done a systematic review. So it's not applied in all scheme types, but where it's appropriate, I think we will continue to try and gently nudge people towards that kind of behaviour, that better behaviour, through the kind of questions we ask. And, you know, people follow the money. I mean, I think Alan Finkel said that very eloquently yesterday. People will follow the money. So that I suppose it's one of our big bits of leverage we have as funding agencies is that we hold the money. And so we have got an opportunity to leverage slight changes in behaviour.
Thank you. And as an example, Hong Kong University can inspire us. They actually have a wonderful, robust system for support for data management plans. Great. Yeah. Our next question, please.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. If the rest of the conference will be like this, I think I'll stay for a few more days.
It will.
My question is on your slide that said setting up the conditions for innovation and impact. You had a bullet point, value added of co-applications and collaborators.
Yeah.
Would that bullet point also include how one manages the attribution, the ethical attribution of the collaborators on a project, essentially making sure that people get their just due as attribution?
Okay, so you're, to a certain extent, on the one side, you've got the people coming into the proposal, if you like, and obviously there are conflict of interest concerns there. On the other side of it, we don't police who is on the papers that come out of. We don't carefully go through the list of authors to say, has everybody who collaborated on this been mentioned in that paper? I suppose, to a certain extent, that comes under good publication practices, and there are very many, excellent guidelines. COPE being the obvious example there of who should be acknowledged on a paper and why, and what their contribution is. What we're interested really is in the people that you propose as your collaborators. So you say, I'm going to do this, I've got this really famous person who's going to be one of my collaborators. And you look at that really famous person, that superstar researcher, and think, well, actually, they're not adding any value to this proposal. They're not really bringing anything to the table here. Right. They're just on this proposal because they're a superstar. That we do look at. Yes, we absolutely do.
Oh, so...
Thank you.
And we ask people to describe what is the value that they are bringing to the proposal.
Thank you,
okay.
Dr. Hiney.
Right,
I will encourage you to continue the conversation on one of the breaks.
Don't forget,
and please
after
come to the
coffee
focus
break.
track. Dr. Leduc, we have time for one more question.
Yes, thank you, Maura, for this very entertaining, interesting presentation. I would like to argue a little bit about the open science project that you have been discussing.
Yes.
And I would like to a little bit criticize your emphasis on the Plan S that many agencies have signed for in Europe, I don't know, elsewhere. And this Plan S is pushing the, there is a big revolution about publication business, and Plan S is focusing on the gold model for publication, which means the researchers have to pay APC. And from a perspective of a researcher, I am a physicist researcher, we think there are many other solutions that the Plan S, and the Plan S is not really fair and not very ethical from the ethical point of view, because it only gives good chances to those who have contracts and a lot of money. And the researchers who are less funded, they cannot pay this high APC, and it will, push the predatory reviews to be. So there are many other solutions you have not mentioned. The preprint, the archives, and the bibliodiversity, and all this. So I think you should be careful not to push Plan S too much.
I think that ship has sailed, Michelle, to be perfectly honest, because the Commission and some of the very large funders in Europe have already committed to doing this. Now, they have backed off on the timelines. It was originally supposed to be 2020, and of course there's been a realisation that that's absolutely ridiculous. There is no way that we can flip over to a completely open access environment by 2020. But I think that the intention is still there, and it's still very strong. But don't forget that it's not just about open access journals and open access publication. There is also a move towards open publishing platforms, and there are already some very interesting examples there. The European Commission has been already had one tender for a European open publishing platform. Now, it wasn't actually fulfilled. They've gone out to tender again, or they're going out to. So I think there are many ways to skin this cat, as it were, and there is a huge awareness that for some disciplines, Plan S doesn't make a huge amount of sense, but for other disciplines it does. So I think over time this will become more nuanced. Yeah, hopefully. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Hiney.